Before we begin to look at the causes and consequences of the Great Depression, it's worth spending some time outlining how the American political system actually worked in the 1920s. The USA had a central government and a series of state governments too. Although there are now 50 states, there were only 48 states in the 1920s. That's because Alaska and Hawaii didn't become states until 1959. And we can think about the political system in America as having three strands. The first strand is the executive. That refers mainly to the president, and the president needs to stand for election every 4 years. The president is charged with carrying out the laws rather than actually making them. Each president appoints a cabinet to help him govern. I say him, it could be him or her, but up until this point all presidents have been men. The second strand is the legislature, and that had the job of framing the laws. And this can be split into the House of Representatives, and that's elected by congressmen, and the job of the House of Representatives is to raise revenue for the government, to raise money for the government to spend. The Senate is made up of 98 senators, 2 from each state. Again, there are now 100 because there are 50 states. The Senate's main role is to ratify or reject presidential appointments. The final arm of government in America comes in the form of the Supreme Court, which was made up of 9 judges, each appointed by the president. However, once appointed, the judges remained in post until death or retirement. Finally, the American Constitution is designed to ensure that there are requisite amounts of what we call checks and balances between these three strands of government. The idea behind that is to ensure that no one part of the government could become too powerful at the expense of others. Now, the two most influential and prominent political parties in America were and are the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, when you're reading about this topic, you'll sometimes see that the Republican Party is referred to as the GOP, which is an acronym for Grand Old Party. In its most simplistic form, you can see the differences between the politics of the two parties. The Republicans tend to favour wealth, business and a reduced government role. The support for the Republicans often comes from richer and more rural areas. On the other hand, the Democrats tended to have a wider base of support. They draw voters from minority ethnic groups, urban dwellers and poorer people in general. The Democrats are essentially more liberal in their politics, believing government has a role to play in helping the most vulnerable in society and being more involved in people's lives. The first 2 American presidents you will come across in this topic are Herbert Hoover, a Republican, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. So let's move on and start to look at what were the causes of the Great Depression. We can divide these up handily into 4 main factors: poverty, problem of farmers, trade problems, and speculation on the stock market. Okay, so firstly, let's have a look at poverty. Now, wealth in America at the time was far more polarized than it is now. There's very few people who had a lot of money. The vast majority of people lived below what we would call the poverty line. Secondly was the problem of farmers. In the 1920s, new machinery was being introduced to American agriculture, and it had helped farmers produce a surplus of food. That means that the supply outstripped the demand. Consequence of this was that food prices fell, and so did incomes for farmers. So in response, the farmers thought, what can we do? And they decided to grow even more food to keep making enough money. However, as you can imagine, this resulted in an even bigger surplus of food, which drove prices down further, and so on. It really became a vicious circle. The farmers' next move was to borrow money from the banks. Some farmers took out mortgages worth $2,000 million, a vast amount of money at the time, well, and now also, of course. However, because their income had dropped, they were unable to pay off the loans, and many farmers were thrown off their land by the banks. By 1929, millions of farmers were out of work and starving. Oh, just going back there to that previous slide, The 1920s in America was sometimes referred to as the Roaring Twenties. Money flowed freely and the standard of living was very high. If you have read or seen the film The Great Gatsby, this gives you some indication of the sort of excess and splendor of the American lifestyle. Nevertheless, not everybody became rich in the Roaring Twenties. For example, a good example of this is a cotton farmer in South Carolina earned 10 times less than a Californian fruit picker. Indeed, the threshold to live with basic necessities in America in the 1920s was $2,000 each year, but 60% of American families lived below that threshold. And a good stat to include is 1/3 of all the income in America was earned by 5% of the population. The majority of people in America at this time lived in poverty, whilst a very small minority were rich, as I previously mentioned. This led to the Depression because of the simple theory of supply and demand. Once the rich had bought as many consumer goods as they wanted, including radios, fridges, and so on, the demand for those goods fell, and consequently factories laid off workers. Quite simply, the supply vastly outweighed the demand. As we've talked about, the farmers, new machinery builds up a surplus of food prices fall, so the farmers try and borrow money from the banks to sort that out, and it doesn't work, because when their income drops and they can't pay off those loans that they borrowed from the banks, the farmers are simply thrown off their land, and by 1929 millions of farmers were out of work and starving. The third problem was that of trade. In 1923, the government put tariffs on foreign goods coming into the USA. This meant that when foreign countries wanted to export goods into the USA, they'd have to pay money to do so. And in turn, that obviously made those goods more expensive. The whole idea behind it was to encourage American people to buy American goods. You'll have heard a very similar message in Donald Trump's campaign speech: buy American, hire American. It's very much mirroring what happened in the 1920s. However, in the 1920s, this plan backfired because other countries responded in turn and put a tariff on American goods going into their countries. That meant that American businesses struggled to sell their goods abroad, leaving them again with a huge surplus of goods, including food, that couldn't be sold. Finally is speculation on the stock market. Many ordinary people were buying shares on the stock market, waiting for the prices to rise and then selling them for a profit. However, too many people were borrowing money to buy these shares, sure that they could pay it back as prices were rising. The credit worked well as long as the prices kept rising. For this to be successful, the prices of the shares had to keep rising. However, doubts about the share prices began to spread in 1928. Companies were unable to sell their goods abroad they were making, so their profits started to fall. Therefore, investors were less keen to buy their shares. This led to a downward spiral, and in October 1929, everybody wanted to sell their shares as they were becoming less valuable. And then it hit crisis point on Thursday, the 24th of October. That became known as Black Thursday, as share prices fell faster and lower than any time before or since. For example, General Electric, that company fell from 315 points to 283 points on the stock market. Another example, US Steel fell from 205 points to 193 points. So in response, 6 rich bankers met and agreed to spend $40 million each buying shares. They did this because they thought that would restore confidence in the stock market and encourage other people to do the same, although on a much smaller scale. And at that point, the crisis seemed to be over. People believed that it had been nothing more than a blip in the stock market and that ultimately prices would keep rising. However, over the next few days, rumours began to spread that the crisis wasn't over. Allegedly, 11 shareholders had committed suicide by jumping from their skyscraper offices, and this all fed into the panic that share prices wouldn't continue to rise, and in fact they would fall sharply. The crash continued because banks were demanding the repayments of borrowed money. Remember, people had borrowed more money than they could afford to speculate on the stock market. This was fine when the share prices had been rising, but now they were dropping. Stockbrokers and people who take money off people and invest it in the stock market for them, they were forced to ask more customers for even more margin to buy their way out of the crisis. However, the only way customers could do this was by selling more shares, which drove down prices lower. Another example of a vicious circle. And on Tuesday, the 29th of October, there was a mad scramble to sell shares at any price. The average price fell by 40 points and shareholders lost a total of $8,000 million. Share prices reached rock bottom in November 1929, and for example, General Motors were trading shares at 182 cents on 3rd of September, but by the 13th of November they were trading at 36 cents. The first consequence of the Great Depression was that over 1 million of the unemployed were homeless. In 1932, 250,000 people stopped paying their mortgages and were subsequently evicted. Some people became hobos and others moved into shanty towns called Hoovervilles. They were ironically named that after President Hoover at the time. Banks failed because many people took out their savings to survive. Some banks didn't have enough cash and went bankrupt. For example, in 1932, 1,616 banks closed down. There were also a number of protests. For example, in Iowa, the Farmers Union organized strikes to stop food from reaching the markets. They hoped that the resulting food shortages caused by this would in turn cause prices to rise and therefore their incomes. Farmers also used pitchforks to chase away officials who tried to evict farmers from their land. A number of ex-servicemen from World War I had been promised government bonuses in 1945. By 1932, many were in such poverty that they demanded them early. In the summer of that year, servicemen from across the country protested at Washington. In June, there was a 20,000 strong Hooverville opposite the White House. However, Congress voted against paying those bonuses, and Hoover actually ordered the army to evict the servicemen. General Douglas MacArthur used a machine gun squadron, 6 tanks and tear gas to clear them out. 2 veterans were killed and 1,000 were injured. Okay, so that just gives us a nice overview of the American political system, how that worked, what the causes and the events of the Great Depression were in 1929 and some of the consequences. I'd like you to have made notes on this video before the lesson so that in the lesson we can discuss some of the bigger picture questions we've got to ask ourselves about the Great Depression.